Golden leaves drifted down Maple Lane, carpeting the sidewalks of the quiet Ohio suburb in shades of amber and crimson. Margaret Ellis sat on her porch swing, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands. The air smelled of autumn, crisp and clean, with a hint of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Her small bungalow, painted a faded yellow, stood at the end of the street, its garden overgrown but still blooming with late marigolds. At 62, Margaret had lived here for decades. First with her husband George, then alone after his passing 5 years ago. The neighborhood had changed, younger families moving in, but her porch remained a constant, a place to watch the world go by. Whiskers sprawled beside her, his orange fur glowing in the afternoon sun, his white-tipped tail flicked lazily, his amber eyes half-closed in contentment. Margaret reached down to scratch behind his ears, smiling softly. "You're my best company, you know that?" she said, her voice warm with affection. Whiskers had wandered into her life 7 years ago, a scrawny stray with a torn ear and a purr that could melt hearts. She'd found him hiding under her hydrangeas, meowing for scraps, and took him in without a second thought. George had laughed, calling him the King of Maple Lane, and the name stuck, even after George was gone. The street was quiet today, most neighbors at work or school. Margaret sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the past, to the classroom where she taught third graders for 30 years, to the evenings she and George spent on this very swing, planning a future they'd never fully share. A pang of loneliness tugged at her chest, but Whiskers shifted closer, his warmth a gentle reminder she wasn't truly alone. A sudden rustle broke her reverie. Whiskers sat up, his ears swiveling toward the garden, his body tensed, his tail puffing slightly as he stared at the overgrown bushes. Margaret followed his gaze, frowning. "What's got you so curious, little king?" she asked, setting her cup down. Whiskers leapt off the swing, landing silently on the porch steps, his eyes locked on something Margaret couldn't see. To Whiskers, the garden was a world of whispers, the rustle of leaves hiding a faint, unfamiliar scent, something sweet and sharp, like sugar and metal. His ears caught a sound, a soft whimper, too quiet for human ears, coming from the tangle of vines near the fence. Margaret didn't hear it, didn't smell it, but she'd learned to trust Whiskers' instincts. He'd once pawed at her coat pocket, revealing a forgotten bottle of heart medication she'd misplaced, a small act that might have saved her life. "All right, let's see what's bothering you," Margaret said, rising slowly, her knees creaking. She grabbed her cane more for balance than necessity and followed Whiskers down the steps. The cat moved with purpose, weaving through the garden, his tail a beacon in the fading light. He stopped at the fence, pawing at a pile of leaves beneath the ivy, his meow sharp and insistent. Margaret knelt carefully, brushing the leaves aside. Her breath caught as she uncovered a small object, a child's hair clip, bright pink with a tiny butterfly charm, tangled in the roots. It wasn't hers, and no children lived on Maple Lane anymore, not since the Hendersons moved away last spring. She turned it over in her hands, her heart quickening. "Where did this come from?" she murmured, glancing at Whiskers. The cat's ears flicked, his gaze darting toward the narrow path behind her fence, a trail that led to the old park a block away. Margaret stood, clutching the hair clip, her mind racing. The park had been abandoned for years, its swings rusted, its slide cracked, a place kids were warned to avoid. But a child might not know better, especially if they were lost. Whiskers meowed again, louder this time, his tail lashing as he slipped through a gap in the fence. "Wait! Whiskers!" Margaret called, hurrying after him, her cane tapping the uneven ground, her shawl slipping as she moved down the path. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer as they reached the park, its empty lot shadowed by towering oaks. Whiskers darted toward the slide, his nose low, sniffing the ground. Margaret caught up, her flashlight beam sweeping the area. The slide's base was littered with leaves, but something else caught her eye. A small sneaker, its laces untied, half buried in the dirt. Nearby, a faint trail of footprints led to a cluster of bushes at the park's edge. But the prints were uneven, as if the child had been stumbling. Scared, as Margaret followed the trail, her flashlight caught something else. A torn piece of dark fabric snagged on a thorny bush, its edges frayed, as if someone had passed through in a hurry. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't just a child's trail. Someone else had been here. Margaret's chest tightened. Memories of her teaching days flooding back. The countless times she'd comforted a lost child, wiped away tears, promised they'd be okay. "Whiskers! We need to find them," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The cat moved ahead, his senses sharp, the whimper growing louder in his ears, a sound of fear and cold. But as they approached the bushes, a sudden noise stopped Margaret in her tracks, a low, guttural growl from the shadows beyond the park, where the trees thickened into a small wooded area. Her flashlight beam darted toward the sound, catching a fleeting glimpse of movement, a dark shape slipping between the oaks, too large to be an animal, too quick to be sure. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. "Whiskers, stay close," she whispered, gripping her cane tighter. The cat's ears flattened, his body low to the ground, but he didn't retreat, his amber eyes fixed on the bushes ahead. The growl faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves, but the sense of being watched lingered, sending a chill down Margaret's spine. She took a shaky step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stop now, we have to find them." Whiskers pushed through the bushes, his meow a beacon, and Margaret parted the branches, her flashlight beam trembling as it landed on a small figure. A girl, curled into a ball, sat shivering against a tree, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. She looked about 6, her pink jacket torn, her eyes wide as she saw Margaret. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Margaret asked, kneeling despite the ache in her joints. The girl nodded, then shook her head, her voice trembling. "I got lost. I was playing, and I couldn't find my way back." Whiskers pressed against her, purring softly, his warmth easing her shivers. Margaret wrapped her shawl around the girl, pulling her close. "You're safe now. What's your name?" "Lily," the girl whispered, clinging to Whiskers. "I live on Oak Street, but I don't know how to get home." Margaret's heart lifted. Oak Street was just 2 blocks away. A new family had moved in last month. She'd heard from a neighbor. "We'll get you there, Lily. Whiskers and I will make sure of it." The walk back was slow, Lily's small hand in Margaret's, Whiskers leading the way with a quiet confidence. The sky darkened, a light drizzle starting as they reached Oak Street. A young woman stood on her porch, her face pale with worry, her voice hoarse from calling Lily's name. She'd been searching for hours, her coat soaked, her hands trembling as she clutched a small teddy bear, one of Lily's favorites. When she saw her daughter, she let out a sob, dropping to her knees as Lily ran into her arms. "Oh, my baby! I thought I'd lost you forever!" she cried, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Lily tight, rocking her back and forth, her voice breaking with relief and exhaustion. Margaret stood back, her own eyes misty, watching the reunion. The woman looked up, gratitude etched into every line of her face. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough," she said, her voice breaking. "She's been gone since noon. I looked everywhere. I was so scared." Margaret smiled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It was Whiskers who found her. He knew something was wrong. I just followed his lead." The woman glanced at the cat, who sat a few steps away, his amber eyes calm but watchful. "He's a hero! A real guardian angel," she said, her voice full of awe. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "He's the king of Maple Lane, always has been." Back on Maple Lane, Margaret sat on her swing, whiskers curled in her lap. The drizzle had stopped, the moon peeking through the clouds, casting a silver glow over the street. Whiskers stretched, then leapt down, padding to the window where he often watched the neighborhood. He sat there, his silhouette framed by the moonlight, his white-tipped tail held high, his posture proud, as if he knew the weight of what he'd done. He turned his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting Margaret's, a quiet acknowledgement of his role, a guardian who'd led a lost child home. Margaret watched him, a warmth spreading through her chest, but her thoughts drifted back to the park, to the torn fabric on the bush, the dark shape in the woods. "You knew she was out there, didn't you?" she murmured to Whiskers. "But that shadow, was it real or just my imagination?" She frowned, her fingers tightening around her cane. Part of her wanted to call the police, to report what she'd seen. But what would she say? That she'd heard a growl, seen a shadow. It could have been a stray dog, a trick of the light. Yet the unease lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, urging her to stay vigilant. The night settled in, peaceful and still. But Margaret felt a shift, a reminder that even in her quiet life, there was purpose, connection, love. Whiskers had brought her more than company. He'd brought her back to the world, one small act of kindness at a time. Somewhere on Oak Street, a little girl slept safe, dreaming of a fluffy orange cat who'd found her in the leaves, a guardian who'd led her home. But in the shadows of Maple Lane, something unspoken remained, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. If Margaret and Whiskers' story warmed your heart, subscribe now. More tales of love and bravery are coming your way. Don't miss out.